Chapter 11 focuses on social networks and gets into a little bit about auctions and portals. This is kind of a light chapter because a lot of you are already very familiar with social networks, and portals gets a little bit into too much detail and in depth for what the average business owner or employee needs to know about portals. But anyhow, we'll hit a few high points. So the growth of social networks. One thing to remember is that when you're looking at the effectiveness of a social network, the number of users is not necessarily the best metric to analyze that particular social network on. There are other ways of evaluating. One way is to look at how much time is spent. For example, TikTok leads both Twitter and Facebook. The average user on TikTok spends more time on the site than the average Facebook user does. Why is that important to e-commerce? The more time spent on a site, the more opportunity for individuals to view your ads, your products, your services. So you do have to look at, when you're looking at those budgeting dollars for how you're going to market with social networks, the first thing is to think, well, we'll go to Facebook. Well, that may or may not be the best choice for your particular product or service. And the other is to look and see how much revenue is generated by each of those platforms for their advertisers. Again, that's looking at the effectiveness of the use of your money. So in general, when we're looking at social networks and digital advertising in general, the social networks only generate about 30% of the total that is there for digital ads. The other 70% comes from websites and being placed there. So understanding what are the important websites for you to have ads on is just as important, perhaps more important, than social media marketing. Now, of course, when we look at the total amount of revenue generated, Facebook is the big player. Yeah, no question. But as I said, they may or may not be the best choice for your business. And the way that social networks generate revenue is through advertising. Social networks, for the most part, do not require users to pay a fee. One exception is LinkedIn. There's a free version of LinkedIn, and then there's a paid version of LinkedIn. But that's a little different because LinkedIn is both a social network, but it's also a business network for, especially if you're job hunting or if you're an HR person looking to find candidates. So it's really two different modes. And the one that applies to e-commerce in general is serviced just fine with the free version. So again, how does LinkedIn pay the bills, keep the lights on? It's through advertising. Kind of talked a little bit that business with social networks, you can use it for marketing your products, but another really important use of social networks is the concept of branding, creating an image in the marketplace as to what your company is and what your company does. And so with that, companies need to be very careful about what they do and say on social media, because it will give them either a positive or a negative, perception to the target market. And there again, you need to understand who your target market is and what issues they align with. So make sure that anything that your business posts on social media is consistent with the people you want to reach. You don't want to have someone not consider your company just because they think that you support a particular political position or something. You want them to evaluate your company on your products and services, not on your philosophies, for the most part. Now, there are ways that you can use, and we'll talk a little bit later, either in this chapter or the next, about how you can make sure that the image of your company is consistent with the general community. But be careful with social media. It's really easy for a company to get a bad image. And certainly social networks, the younger audiences are more plugged into social networks than older. And so again, understanding your target market. Are you trying to reach a young audience, or are you trying to reach a more mature audience? There's trade-offs. It can be one of the great uses of social media is a listening tool. So you can be monitoring what's being said about your company, your products, your services, and recognize if there's a negative trend going on that you need to do something about. So it's an important way of recognizing what the general populace is thinking about you. And it's important, therefore, that you have someone monitoring the social media content, discussing your products or company 24/7, 365. This is not a Monday to Friday, 8 to 5 position. You have to have someone who is constantly monitoring what is being said, because if something really bad is presented about your company, you have to be able to respond to it very quickly, or it can go viral. There are tools out there, so that you think, oh, gee, great, I have to pay someone to sit in front of a screen and be scrolling through social media, even on weekends and holidays. And the answer is no. There are tools that you can use that will send you an alert when certain keywords associated with your company, when it finds it on social media. And so in that case, you have someone on call who, if those keywords trigger an alert, that individual can take a look, see what's going on, and decide, is this something we need to react to, or can it wait till Monday? Let's go to the next slide. Now, the dark side of social networks. And from my perspective, social networks in general are very dark. I question the legitimacy and the value of social networks to our society. I think they started out as a good idea. And if you watch that Netflix documentary called The Social Dilemma, you will see that the founders of things like Pinterest and others, they had noble aspirations for what the social media sites could do for society. Unfortunately, those noble, objectives and hopes for social media were long ago abandoned, and social media has been corrupted. Personally, I do not use social media. I've gotten so disgusted with the intentional bias and disruption that social media does that I just won't use it. So one of the issues that comes up, though, however, even though I don't use it with my company, I would be monitoring it, because I can't pretend it doesn't exist. I may not choose to read and post, but I need to have something that is monitoring to see if something negative is being said about the company. And so the question really comes, how do you determine whether those negative comments that you're seeing are legitimate customer complaints, or is your competition flooding with negative things. There have been several high visibility cases where a company has been seriously harmed financially by a competitor using false negative comments. Now, of course, they turned around and sued, but you want to do that unless you absolutely have to. What you want to do is recognize, okay, are these negative comments real and we need to do something about it, or do you need to contact the social media site and lodge a complaint that these things are being posted are erroneous and need to be pulled down? And here's a question to ask yourself. Do you think that negative comments influence how people decide to make a purchase? Personally, when I'm looking at something, an item on Amazon, the first thing I'll do is I'll go and look and see how many people gave it a 1 star. And then I will go and read some of the 1 star comments and see, do these make sense? Or is this just somebody that didn't know what they were doing? They didn't know how to set it up. Sometimes you read some of those negative comments, you go, that makes no sense at all. Does it influence my purchase? Slightly. If I see a lot of negative comments that all have a similar content to them, and I go, yeah, that would bother me if that was true, then I might dig a little deeper to see on it. So does it influence my purchase? A little bit. It might cause me to research a little bit more or to look at another product. But it's something to ask yourself, do your customers, how influenced are they by negative comments? And something for your business to address too is, should you, as a business, have any guidelines for your employees as to what they can or can't say on social networks outside of the office? I think this depends on the position within the company. Now, someone working on the assembly floor, if they post a radical rant about something or whatever, is it going to tarnish the company? Probably not. But if it's one of your board members that does that, then yes, that could negatively impact the company. So I think probably most businesses should have some sort of a tiered structure of saying, just informing the employees, if you want to continue to stay employed with us, this is the type of behavior we expect from you. We're not influencing your right to free speech, but your right to free speech, if it's inflammatory and reflects negatively on the company, could impact your employment. So are Facebook's algorithms dangerous? Well, as we saw in an earlier assignment with filter bubbles, oops, I got a spelling error there, which I will have to correct. Yes, I think that's pretty obvious that the filter bubbles do impact and have made things worse in this country. So the real question, I think, for society is, to what degree should we hold the social media sites responsible for presenting a balanced perspective on things, of having, for example, both liberal and conservative opinions, to have opinions that are for vaccination, that are against vaccination. To what extent should the site be responsible to monitor that and try and ensure a better balanced thing? This hasn't been worked out in the courts. There's some concerns about putting any restrictions or responsibility on the social media sites. We could spend an entire, afternoon talking about the pros and cons and dangers of this. But it is a legitimate question that's out there right now that has not been resolved. I already mentioned the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. I highly encourage you to watch it. I think it's very useful information. Okay, online auctions. I suspect that many of you have participated in an online auction. Certainly, with the advent of the smartphone and the dynamics that occurred within COVID, a lot of people have become familiar with online auctions. It's oftentimes a C2C, consumer to consumer, and many times it's B2C too, a business to consumer auction. And the auction company, most common one is eBay, is strictly an intermediary. They provide the platform and basis where buyers can display their products or services, and sellers can, find that and negotiate a price and, create a transaction. eBay is no question the market leader. However, there are a number of other auction sites out there. And like I said, particularly in the aftermath of the pandemic, that really encouraged the growth there. Some of the ones you may run across, HighBid, Deal Dash, Property Room. I thought that one was interesting because you can actually bid on things that have been seized. When the police arrest, a criminal, they find a bunch of stolen property. If there's no way to identify whose property that was, it's not unique or serialized or whatever, you can bid on that stolen or recovered property from governments. I haven't gone to that site. I will have to, just for fun, go sometime just to see everything that's listed on there. You can also find sites that specifically are focused on like nonprofits. Zeffy is one. Again, I haven't used it personally, but and it is also becoming more widely used now in B2B e-commerce. So businesses, when a business needs some parts or materials or supplies, that they can go there. Again, COVID really kind of accelerated that when there were real problems in the supply chain. And so if someone had an excess of inventory on hand that they would be willing to sell, they could post it, and someone who was desperate could get it. An example, when we were having our furnace system replaced in the midst of COVID, there was a shortage in the ductwork. And so every day, the company I was working with here locally, every day they were checking to see, did anyone have some extra ductwork left over? Typically you go out to a site and you take more inventory than you need. And so when the job is complete, you may have some pieces left over. And so they were constantly checking every day to see, did anyone in the Northwest come back from a job site with extra material left over so that they could get it. And they were able to find, they had to go to several different companies that had a few extra pieces left over to get everything for our system, but they were able to get it in and didn't impact the timeline. Okay, types of auctions. I'll just mention this briefly because you may hear the term an English auction. Well, what is an English auction? It's where you have a single item, or it could be a lot, lot of 24 of the same item, or a lot of miscellaneous, goods. But you put that up for sale and it goes to a single buyer from a single seller. And in this case, with an English auction, at the completion of the auction time frame, the highest bidder wins. Whoever is willing to pay the most gets it. Conversely, a reverse auction is the companies have a product or service, and you've put out an interest. Now, let's say, go back to my furnace system. If I had posted and said, I'm looking for 10 pieces of 5-inch ductwork, then a reverse auction would be a company in Spokane says, well, we've got 10 pieces. We'll sell them to you for $25 each. And a company in Seattle says, well, we've got 10 pieces. We'll sell you, but we'll sell it to you at $21 each. And someone in Idaho says, well, I can do better than that. I'll sell it to you for $19 each. And so in this case, it's the lowest bidder gets my business because they are actually bidding for my business. I'm not bidding for the product. I put out and said, I will pay up to, say, $25 a piece. And then other companies will say, I can meet that price or I can do better than that. And where this is commonly used a lot is by government agencies. The lowest bidder wins the contract. Now you can say, well, that's great. That saves government money. Well, yes and no. Because you really don't want the lowest bidder. You want the lowest bidder with the best performance. It's a balance between price and the services provided. Back to my HVAC system, when we decided to put in this new system, I got bids from 7 different companies. And those bids ranged quite a bit in price. I did not go with the lowest price. I didn't go with the highest price either. I went with one in the middle because I felt they offered it was a reasonable price, but the services they provided, their design was superior to the others. So anyhow, that's when we talk about a reverse auction. Now, one of the questions when you're dealing with auctions is, are you really getting a good deal? So auction prices are not necessarily the lowest. I have been to auctions and seen people pay more, significantly more, for an item in auction than they could buy in the store any day of the week. And you go, well, how does that happen? Well, live auctions are social events. If you haven't ever been to a live auction, I encourage you to go to one sometime. They're really kind of funny to watch the dynamics of what goes on. The key to understanding there is you have this thing called herd behavior, where you get a frenzy, a bidding going on things. And that's how people get caught up and they pay too much for something. I had the opportunity, there was a computer company that had gone out of business here locally, and my son, the nephew, was visiting with us. And so I took my son and my nephew to the auction. And like I told them ahead of time, said, okay, this is what we're looking for. And this is the most that we'll pay for something. When you go to an auction, you need to know what it is you want and the maximum that you're willing to pay. And that may mean that you walk away from the auction with nothing because others bid it up too high for what you had agreed to spend. And so you have to be willing to walk away from that. You also have to be willing to not be caught up with, ooh, that looks good. Maybe we should bet on that. If you didn't intend to buy it when you went there, that's probably not a good idea. Something's not a good deal unless it is something that you need. It's a good price and you have the money to pay for it. So some of the things that can happen is you can have a winner's regret. That's what some of these people that when we were at the computer auction, I'm sure they got home and they said, "Well, I got this, but darn, I paid too much. You know, I could have gotten a better unit for the same amount of money if I had just waited and come home." So you end up with that winner's regret, or you end up with a seller's lament. That's where a seller sold something going, "Gee, if I'd known it would only get that amount, I don't think I would have sold it. I would have kept it, that, so that's why you'll see sometimes auctions do have minimum bids because the seller has said, if I can't get at least this much for it, I don't want to sell it. And the loser's lament is when you get home, you go, I chickened out. I really should have gone, another round or two with bids on that. That was a good deal. I shouldn't have let it get by. You can avoid all of those by thinking about it ahead of time and just planning for it and knowing that when you go to a live auction or even an online auction, you can have that happen. I've bid for things on eBay, and in the last few seconds, you can see a whole bunch of people running up the bid. And I've had to walk away and say, that's more than I wanted to pay for that. So I'm not interested. But that all comes thinking about things ahead of time. Okay, that's it for chapter 11.